All right. Okay. Welcome everybody to the September edition of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture webinar series. Today, Dr. Howie Harshaw will be speaking to us about Human Dimensions 101. Howie, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Ian. Appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Nothing like starting a 101 class in September. I think that puts us in line with a lot of our kids and friends and whatnot. So thanks for joining us today. So what I thought I'd do today is provide an introduction to the human dimensions approach and provide some definitions of what it is, provide some sort of broad examples of the kinds of things that human dimensions inquiries can do. I won't be going into detail about specific examples, but could certainly do so at another time if there is interest. So Aldo Leopold has provided the conservation community with a lot to think about. There was one quote that really resonates with me, and this is it. It says, "There are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land." And I think at its core, Human Dimensions is interested in these things as well. How do people get along together? But more in particular, how do people get along together in natural areas and natural spaces? And how do their interactions with the environment affect the environment? And of course, there can be positive and negative outcomes. And sometimes these interactions with nature aren't direct. For example, people may make donations to various conservation organizations, and that's part of their relationship with the land, but might not be captured in this sort of direct engagement that we might think about. So I would encourage all of us to think about people's interactions with nature more broadly than we might with just sort of direct contact. Of course, there have been some changes, many changes, since Aldo Leopold made this statement. Rick Searle, who many of you might recognize, is a Canadian author who's done a lot of work in and around our national parks, provincial parks, and other protected areas. And he suggests that humans seem to have gained a high degree of independence from the natural world. He goes on, "Humanity appears to have very nearly lost a sense of deep connectedness to nature." This experience, I think, is also reflected with our neighbors to the south. Ken Salazar, who was the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, observed that the biggest single threat to conservation in America is the growing disconnect of our people with the outdoors. And of course, this is true for Canada as well. Increased urbanization has made it difficult for many people to maintain their connections to nature. And for some folks, they haven't even had that opportunity to begin to develop that relationship with nature. And that has implications, of course, for conservation. I think it also has implications for more broadly in the sort of how we communicate, think about, and prioritize nature, ecological goods and services, and many of the traditional activities such as hunting and fishing and other activities that we do on the landscape. Those traditional connections are being tested. And this is an exciting time on the one hand for research to try and sort this out. But I think it's also a time of a little bit of anxiety for those of us in the conservation world, considering and worrying about our connection with people and perhaps the dwindling of particular stakeholder groups. These are human dimensions issues. And I hope that this overview today provides some ways of thinking about how we might investigate and think more deeply and understand people's connections to nature. Now, of course, when we think about conservation, it isn't just the people, it's habitat, it's wildlife, but it is also people, and it's the relationship between these three elements. Those biologists listening today, you might be glad to know that actually the term human dimensions comes out of biology, and it was biologists thinking about this application of management and how do we begin? How can we have successful management outcomes? And certainly we do need to manage different aspects of ecosystems, focus on particular species, focus on particular landscapes. But I would also suggest when we think about conservation planning and management, a big part of that is managing people. And that's, again, what Human Dimensions focuses on. But we do that not in isolation. We certainly do consider these interactions and impacts and other outcomes to wildlife and habitat. I think one way that we can think about human dimensions research is really thinking not just about those connections, but thinking about the endeavor of human dimensions research as applied social science. It's social science. We're drawing upon many different disciplines to look at these problems that have been identified by conservation partners, government agencies, and sometimes private landowners. And it really is the identification of particular issues, often sort of biologically driven. There's some sort of threat to a particular habitat or species, or there's pressures that we need to think about. Often these human dimension problems are identified by practitioners, by folks actually doing the work. Often they're biologists, other disciplines of science as well. But understanding people is sometimes outside of our traditional training. That said, the human dimensions approach has made some great strides over the last 20 to 30 years, and I think has become somewhat embedded in many of the management and planning actions that we do throughout North America. Well, what is human dimensions then? Well, the term human dimensions refers to how and why humans value natural resources, how humans want resources managed, and how humans affect or are affected by natural resources management decisions. Human dimensions inquiries strive to understand human traits and how to incorporate that understanding into planning and actions. So here we really are focused on these natural resources, but I think we're considering natural resources pretty broadly, and not just those that may have commercial value, but including things like ecological goods and services, as well as other resources that may not be captured in markets. Human Dimensions covers a variety of ideas and practices, including cultural, social, and economic values, individual and social behavior, demographics, legal and institutional frameworks of management, communication and education, and decision-making processes of management. Now, of course, I run the risk of suggesting that human dimensions is everything to all people, and of course that's not the case. But human dimensions researchers and research in general is able to draw upon and draw from a variety of different disciplines and contexts, and using some of these precedents are able to find solutions or at least provide more evidence to support decision making. As I mentioned, human dimensions work is really interdisciplinary. It's applied social science at its core, but it can draw upon a number of different fields and disciplines. There really isn't a human dimensions discipline. And I think many different folks call themselves human dimensions researchers, but we don't all look alike. And we don't all come from the same places. Often when we think of human dimensions, we think about interacting with the public through either communication efforts to let people know about new regulations or new opportunities. So certainly understanding communication science is going to be important. This is a two-way conversation often, and sometimes we need help with that. We can think about humanities and how that might inform some of the problems that we have, including those of philosophy. How are people thinking? Why are they thinking these ways? Looking at history, but also thinking about different cultures and how we might think about ethics and how that might affect people's behaviors in the way they think about these particular landscapes. My particular approach is that of social and behavioral sciences. I draw on my backgrounds in sociology and social psychology to really help understand people's engagement with nature and try and sort out what the things are that prompt and influence these behaviors, but also some of the outcomes of that behavior and how it can affect the way that people think and understand about the world around them. That said, I think we need to think about some questions perhaps that help us to focus on those things that Human Dimensions does investigate. So here are four broad questions that we might think about to begin to guide our initial forays or continued engagement in human dimensions research. So with a particular focus on wildlife, but we could substitute the term wildlife for particular ecosystems, particular species, and of course, plants as well. So how and why do people value wildlife and or other natural resources? How do people want wildlife to be managed? How do people affect and how are they affected by wildlife decisions? Wildlife management decisions as well as wildlife, and how can we incorporate people's preferences into wildlife management and planning? So certainly from these questions, we can see that there is some interaction involved. We're seeking information from people, from our stakeholders, from those folks who are using our conservation lands, from those folks who are supporting our conservation organizations. And it's often just sort of regular folks, people who go hiking and hunting and fishing, wildlife viewing. So there is this engagement that's necessary to understand what that interaction is or those interactions are. But I do need to say pretty quickly on that we're not really looking to manage our natural resources, to manage wildlife by public opinion. Just because members of the public would like something to be a certain way doesn't mean we need to do it that way. Human Dimensions provides information and evidence around sort of these social aspects of conservation. But we have to consider that information with that of biology and ecology and other disciplines involved in the management of our public lands. So we're not, it's because someone might want to harvest 50 moose in a season doesn't mean we're going to let them do that. We certainly have to think about carrying capacity, population health, and these other things. So Human Dimensions is really just another piece of information to help us make decisions. We have some principles, too, that guide Human Dimensions investigations and research. And some of these, they're not going to seem too strange to you, but I think it's important to kind of get them out there. First and foremost, I think we need to recognize, at least from this perspective, that people are not separate from nature. People are very much a part of nature. We've evolved in these natural systems over thousands of years. And one of the first principles recognizes that human and ecosystem interactions are natural and they depend on one another. We also recognize that ecosystems are complex and they're managerially challenging. Even though we probably know a lot more about the ecology and biology of landscapes and natural places, there's still a lot we need to sort out. There's still a lot of detail and nuance we don't know. That's exciting for sure. But oddly, we know, I would suggest, less about these human interactions. How people are affecting these landscapes, we have evidence of that. We have great case studies. But the other side of things, how are people affected by natural areas? How does immersion and engagement in these natural places change the way people think about nature? Can it change the way they behave? Can it change their preferences for different management? Those are kind of the exciting questions, I think. We also recognize that the character and the complexity of ecosystems vary by interacting temporal and spatial scales. And I think this highlights another aspect of Human Dimensions research that makes it different from some of the other social sciences. And that is that often the people engaged in Human Dimensions research have this knowledge about sociology, perhaps, or psychology, history, ethics, communication. But there's also some understanding and awareness of, and maybe perhaps even deep knowledge about ecology and biology. So we often have people in Human Dimensions who are multidisciplinary, but some of those other disciplines they're aware of and inform their work are those of biology and ecology. And I think that nexus is really important, not just for understanding the context, but also for thinking about some of the possible solutions as well. Certainly, I think Human Dimensions also recognizes that sound, responsible management is the key human role in ecosystem sustainability. And as I mentioned before, yes, we do have to manage landscapes and the various components of landscapes, but I think also we need to recognize that we need to actively manage people. And we do this. This isn't something that's new. We do this all the time in parks and protected areas. There's different rules and regulations that constrain behavior. Often the constraints to human behavior in parks and protected areas are guided by things like ecological health, ecological integrity, as well as perhaps individual wildlife that that may be interacting with particular campsites or campers and creating issues. So we have to think about this. And again, human dimensions operates at these different scales as well, from individuals, individual wildlife or individual people, but also to populations and communities of wildlife and people too. But certainly we are concerned with these notions of conservation and sustainability, and that does guide a lot of the work that gets done in human dimensions research. Well, let's think about how we manage people. What is it that we're ultimately concerned with? I think perhaps the most obvious one would be people's behaviors. We want people to behave in appropriate ways in and around nature, in and around wildlife. And often these behaviors are influenced, at least for many people, by their experiences, by the things that they have done before. And that's true, but I'd suggest behaviors are also influenced by other things. And this diagram is called the cognitive hierarchy. It comes out of psychology, and I think it's just a way of thinking about what can influence the behaviors, the things that we're interested in. But I think it also lets us understand some of the structure of the way that people make decisions and the way that people think. So at the top of this inverted pyramid, you can think of it as maybe a bit of an iceberg, where the majority of that is something that we don't see. It is sort of below the surface. Behaviors are easily and readily observable, and we can do things with that. But when we start to get at things like the way that people intend to behave, that becomes a bit more challenging. We wouldn't know that unless we ask people directly. That's not something that's apparent. And the same is true of people's attitudes, what they think about particular things. Now, I did mention earlier that we're really not interested in managing natural resources by public opinion. Not only would that be really challenging, we'd probably be having to shift our direction every week. But again, planners, managers, natural resource scientists have specialized knowledge about the things that are being managed and planned for, and we're not seeking to throw that aside. Instead, we're really trying to find ways to inform the management of these places, thinking about how we might influence people, influence their behaviors. So again, looking back at this cognitive hierarchy, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and let's look at the bottom, this bottom part that's focused on values. And it's interesting, at this lower part of sort of this cognitive hierarchy, the sort of space devoted to these different elements, the values, the value orientations, and so forth, are somewhat reflective of sort of the size or the amount of values or value orientations a person might have. So closer to the bottom of this hierarchy, things like values, they're few in number. Values are often sort of imparted on us at a really early age in childhood. And we get our values through parenting, through social institutions like churches and clubs and associations and our community. And we start to get a sense of what's acceptable and what isn't, what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. And these are pretty fundamental ideas, fundamental things values are. And they're few in number. We're guided by some, very sort of a manageable set of things that we deem to be important or good and bad. And these values are pretty slow to change. They're really deeply rooted. Again, we've had these often since childhood, so you can imagine trying to change the direction of these would be pretty challenging. They are slow to change, and they are pretty central to our beliefs. Values also tend to transcend situations, and they're pretty stable in that regard. One level up, we have value orientations. We might think of these as basic belief patterns or sort of broader ways of expressing our values. One example might be the continuum of anthropocentric and biocentric ways of looking at the world. So you have this biocentric orientation, the idea that nature has intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, independent of any kind of importance that people might give to it. If we're going to take the extreme position of biocentrism, we would agree probably that people are no more or no less important than any other species. No more important than a banana slug, but no less important either. On the other side of the spectrum, we have a more anthropocentric viewpoint, which holds that really nature is there, natural resources are there for human use, and that the worth or importance of these natural resources are a reflection of the value given to them by people. Now, those are extreme positions, and it's unlikely we would run into anyone who holds those sort of really extreme views. Often we're somewhere in the middle. But we can think of even that continuum of biocentrism, anthropocentrism, as a value orientation, a way that we might sort of reflect our deeper values in other sorts of decisions. One level up from that, we have attitudes and norms, and attitudes are often something we talk a lot about in human dimensions research. What do you think about it? What do you think about species at risk management in Saskatchewan? Well, that's a really interesting conversation right now with various land transfers that just happened, and some of the regulatory frameworks that are shifting as well. So attitudes are things that people think about things. We often would think about attitudes as opinions, but sometimes when we think about opinions, we often don't think that they're kind of thoughtful. They might often think of opinions as being knee-jerk reactions, and maybe sometimes they can be. But attitudes are a bit more formal and perhaps a bit more thoughtful. We also have norms, and for the purpose of today, let's just think about norms as values that are held by society or by a larger group of people, by a community, things that a community or a group deems to be right or wrong or good or bad. Now, all of these three sort of elements, the values, the value orientations, the attitudes and norms, influence our behavioral intentions, ways that we think we should be behaving or acting in particular circumstances. You know, we may have the behavioral intention that I'm going to go fishing this weekend, and I'm going to engage in catch and release fishing. That's not only the regulation where I'm going, but it's also congruent with what I believe to be right. If I release the fish, it's there for others to enjoy as well, but perhaps I haven't altered that fish's life course. But maybe we're out fishing, and you know what? We catch a really great trophy, and there's all sorts of things we need to navigate, sort of these regulatory frameworks and stuff, but maybe even though we intended to catch and release, maybe we decide to hang on to that trophy anyway. So our behavior might be different from our intention. Now that's kind of an extreme example. It involves some rule breaking, which I think would keep most people on the straight and narrow, but we know it happens. So why are people's behaviors sometimes inconsistent with their intentions, with their overall attitudes, and perhaps inconsistent with their values? These are some of the investigations that we can begin to look into to foster this understanding with human dimensions research. Now, of course, behavioral intentions are pretty context specific, and our behaviors might change depending on what that context is. Just to give a sense of the kinds of things we can investigate, I would also say that the further down the hierarchy we go, when we start to approach attitudes, value orientations, and values, they become a bit more difficult to measure. As I mentioned earlier, behaviors are readily observable. We can see what a person does, how they respond to things, different stimuli. But it's far more challenging to see a person's value. What is it? So we have to come up with ways of investigating these attitudes and norms, and that's where we can draw on some of these social science disciplines to help us do that. Of course, in any investigation, there's going to be potential sources of error, and many of these are the same that you would find in the biological sciences. And with that, I would really encourage all of you to think about human dimensions research or any sort of applied social science as science. The same expectations you have of your ecological colleagues, you should have of your social science colleagues. Things like representative sampling, for example, are just as important in social science as they are in ecology. The assumptions that we make, the statistical tools that we use, often have assumptions built into them as well. We have to recognize those. Social science is a science. I'm not going to, get my hair on fire about it, but all that to say is that we need to have the similar expectations of social scientists. And I think the social scientists will rise to that occasion. But of course, when we're making our observations, even when we're making observations of behavior, they can be inaccurate. We really need to have strong methods to guide the investigations that we make. And we have to develop these methods a priori so that when we're actually investigating things, we don't change track. We also need to be cautious of overgeneralizing. Part of this has to do with just the inferences we might make about things and some of these areas of logic. But we also have to think about how we're selecting the people that we're observing, selecting the people that we're delivering surveys to, selecting the people that we're meeting with. Have we selected these people in a purposeful manner, or are we really trying to seek some kind of random selection? Just like in sort of non-social science, bias is important, and how we select those people has an influence over how we're able to generalize. We must be cautious around selective observation. And we also need to be cautious about illogical reasoning. Of course, there's solutions to this as well. First and foremost would be replication. Often when we think of replication, it involves looking at sort of the same context, the same populations, the same elements, but doing it again to make sure we're getting things right. And that's an important part for sure. But often we can find similar situations in other places. And sometimes we're able to use a method used in Colorado or rural Quebec or northern British Columbia that could suit well what's going on in a particular part of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or Alberta. Of course, having large representative samples increases not only our power to find different effects, but it also increases the likelihood that we're going to be representing that broad range of people and that broad range of attitudes. And that's really important. Of course, these large representative samples also allow us to examine particular groups and perhaps compare groups with one another to figure out, who might be the most appropriate stakeholder for this particular project or this particular issue. We also have theory that we can apply, and this, is sort of comes off of replication a little bit. We have theory which guides us, and often the theories that we look at have been developed elsewhere, perhaps developed in different contexts, but like many theories, they provide us with a roadmap for understanding potential relationships between things. Theories are explanations. Do these explanations hold places? What can we learn from that? This is a slide that I use in some of my research methods class, and really sort of thinking about theory and thinking about how we are able to generalize. And again, this is going to be review for many of you, but again, we need to be holding social science to the same expectations and bars that we hold other fields of science to. You can think of this in terms of, well, how do we generalize from our study to different settings, times, people, and places? And it really depends on, well, how similar are those other settings, people, places, and times? Of course, the more similar these elements are to our study, the easier it is to make these generalizations. And the further away these places are, or the differences in the people and times that we're looking at, might make it more challenging to make these generalizations. So again, we need to be cautious. But again, theory, just sort of structured explanations, can set us on a path for understanding things in more of a structured way. Now, I'm just going to quickly go over two examples of theories. I'm not actually going to get down to the nitty-gritty, although, as you might imagine, I would love to chat about this more, and if we can arrange some sort of PHJV brown bag and beer session, you got to sign me up. But one of the things we can think about is social capital. Now, we've heard this term bandied about quite a bit, but sometimes it's less clear what it is we're talking about. Social capital, like other forms of capital, financial capital, we might think of as something that has value and something that is also transactional. We can think of social capital as being those social goods that provide benefits, things like information, other things like social support. And we can think about, well, why would we need to think about things like information and social support? Well, look at the R3 programs around hunting, where we're seeking to recruit new members, retain existing hunters, and re-engage or reactivate people who used to hunt but don't. Sometimes social support plays a really big role in a person's ability to engage in an activity like hunting. Think of a new hunter, someone who we might try to recruit. If there's no social support to provide that mentorship to demonstrate how you need to handle a firearm, how you can work with various landowners to gain access to their properties and so forth, that's not something that comes naturally. We do need this sort of social support to do that. So that's why things like social capital can be important for human dimensions issues. We might think, if we look at the right-hand side of that slide, thinking about political engagement, how do we get people more engaged in land use planning exercises? How can we get more stakeholder engagement in some of the other decisions that we make? What about empowering local communities so they have a bit more say about what happens in the lands that are adjacent to them? What about natural resource decisions that have an influence on social cohesion? If we think of these as possible outcomes of social capital, we need to take some steps back to think about, well, how do we begin to foster those things? So things like memberships in informal groups, ACA, or your local friends of Elk Island National Park, or friends of this place or that place, or the Edson Hunting Club. These serve important social functions, and they do provide this support. They provide means and mechanisms for exchanging information, and again, for connecting people. And I think that's an important aspect of people's engagement in natural areas, people's engagement in outdoor recreation. At its core, it can be a pretty social thing. And when we engage in these socialization ideas, not only do we strengthen communities and strengthen our relationships, but I think we also strengthen our connections to the natural world. And I think that's a pretty important outcome as well. Speaking about activities, another way of thinking about and explaining people's engagement in their particular activities they do, one of them is called recreation specialization. Now, those of you who know me know that I could probably go on for days about this. I'm going to see if I can constrain it to about 3 or 4 minutes. But recreation specialization is just a way of looking at the ways that people are engaged in particular activities. So again, let's look at waterfowl hunting. A person can be engaged in waterfowl hunting in a variety of different ways. And we know that there's not just one sort of indicator or dimension of that engagement. A person can be engaged in waterfowl hunting somewhat peripherally. Maybe they're just a beginning hunter, and they start off as a relative generalist. Maybe they don't really care too much about if they're shooting over field or water. Maybe they're not too concerned about the particular species of waterfowl they're going after. But the more that they're engaged in that activity, it's possible that they become more committed to it. Not everyone maintains that waterfowling activity, but for some it does. So what makes those generalists different from those who continue? We also know that when we're talking about particular recreation activities like waterfowl hunting, there's different aspects of it that we need to think about. Whether you have this sort of the affective dimension, or that psychological attachment that people have to the activity. We all know folks, I imagine, who are waterfowl hunters, and waterfowling is pretty central to their lives. You want to get together for dinner in the fall? Well, you're probably going to have to schedule that around opening day for sure, but other opportunities and other events that the people might have already planned for waterfowl hunting. We've met people and you say, well, what do you do? And, oh, I'm a banker, I'm an academic, I'm a biologist. But I think we've all met people and we ask that question and they say, I'm a waterfowl hunter. That would be someone whose activity is very central to their lives. We might think of them as more of a specialist. There's a behavioral dimension as well. We focus on things like avidity or the frequency of participation, how long they've been engaged in the activity, and how familiar they are with different settings. Certainly, the more a person participates, the more a person's engaged in a particular activity like waterfowl hunting, they're going to become more familiar with different settings. This is somewhat related to the cognitive dimension, or those skills and knowledge that are acquired over time around a particular activity. Certainly in waterfowl hunting, you're going to have to be able to identify birds in flight. That can be challenging. You also have to know how to safely and effectively operate a firearm. You need to know how to lay out your decoys in particular patterns for whatever it is you're going after. And you're going to tweak that as you learn more about these things. So these three dimensions really work together. And what's interesting is that we find that people who are more specialized in waterfowling think differently about wetlands and waterfowl than the generalists do. And there's some management implications from that. But again, it's not just how often are you participating or what do you think about this. We're not so concerned about the what. We're also concerned about the why and the how. Why are people behaving this way? Why are people not paying attention to these regulations? And understanding their engagement, for example, in recreation activities might help us do that. So that's the theory piece. But as I mentioned, there are certainly various pitfalls and whatnot that we need to be thinking about, just like we would in any sort of scientific endeavor. So one pitfall, and this comes from a little research, well, a little sort of memo or research note by DJ Case and Associates. It's a consulting group that works a lot with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And they identified, 6 different sort of pitfalls. One is expecting definitive answers from social science. That's a challenge. Certainly, social systems, just like biological systems, are dynamic and they're changing. It depends on who you engage with and how you engage with people. It's not to say you can't get a good answer at the end of the day, but we need to recognize that social science is a process and that people's attitudes, people's behavioral intentions change with different contexts, different information that's given to them. And we need to be aware of that. I think there's also a need for social science monitoring. This would monitor particular wildlife populations. It might be worthwhile to actively monitor particular human populations or stakeholder groups. Another pitfall in human dimensions approaches is making the means the ends. So for example, often we engage in surveys, and surveys are a big deal. If you've been engaged in survey development, designing the questionnaire often takes far longer than we expect it to, and becomes, in a sense, almost all-consuming. But we have to be careful that we're not just focused on the survey, but what's the information that we're trying to seek with that survey? What's that management question we're seeking to inform? What's the evidence that we need? And focus on those outcomes and not get too wrapped up in the method itself. And that can be challenging, partly because trying to sort out these public attitudes and survey data can be a lot of fun. But you got to get out of that analysis paralysis loop and think about, okay, how is this going to inform my decision? Another pitfall is making our human dimensions problems too small. They may seem pretty obvious to us in terms of what needs to be done, but again, sometimes because social science is a process, we need to, take people by the hand and walk them through a particular problem. Sometimes we need to build the capacity of a particular stakeholder group so that they can better appreciate what these relationships might be. We need to be honest about the size of our problems. And I think that helps to set our expectations. We have to be careful not to reach for the same solution every time. There's a range of different interventions and approaches that we can use in social science. and human dimensions approaches. Yes, surveys are often the bread and butter, but there are other approaches that we can use as well. Citizen juries, for example, is an approach being used by John Parkin's colleague in resource economics and environmental sociology in the Faculty of Ales at U of A. We can engage in workshops and just public meetings, information sessions, interviews. There's a lot of different things that we can do to engage people. We need to, again, try to do many different things because different approaches will resonate with different people. And if we really do want to get a broader sense of what people are thinking, what our stakeholders are thinking, we need to think about engaging with them in different ways. We have to be cautious not to practice exemptionalism, the idea that somehow we are separate from or different than other people. And because it's a social endeavor when we engage with people. Even when we give people a survey, it's a social transaction. And practicing empathy, this sort of this understanding, and a willingness to think perhaps outside of your own attitudes, outside of your own sort of, we'll call them mental constraints, is going to be pretty important. And I guess the last pitfall would be focusing on barriers. Often we get really concerned about what the problem is, and if only people understood this, they would do things differently. So what is this particular constraint or barrier? And we need to sometimes flip that around to think about, well, how can we do this differently so that we can bring people in and begin to understand it or walk this journey together instead of focusing too much on what the problem is? How can we get around that problem? Now, I appreciate that might be too kumbaya for some of you, but I think there's also some real meat thinking about some of these different pitfalls. So I just want to finish up here. I hope I've left enough time for questions, but just some final thoughts around human dimensions research and approaches. First is that engaging the public takes time. It really is building up trust. You need to trust the people and the information that you're getting for sure. But people need to trust you and your organizations as well. So it does take time to develop that relationship and develop that trust. Then you get that information, then you need to incorporate that into your planning and management actions. And if you haven't really focused on the human dimensions sort of aspects and elements before, that can be challenging because it might change the shape or direction of what you might typically do in a particular context. Social license is important. We can think of social license as that sort of public support for what you're looking to do. And because we're often engaged in working on Crown lands and other public lands, it's important to have that public support, that social license. But when you start to engage with people, when you start to develop these relationships with particular stakeholder groups or particular communities or particular populations, it requires a commitment. It requires a commitment on your part as the manager or the planner, but it also requires commitment on their part too, to keep showing up at the meetings, to be honest and truthful with you. And those are good things. That's, well, there's some social capital building right there. But we need to recognize too that when we engage people, we're also raising their expectations. If you're doing a survey, for example, and some public meetings around changing a licensing scheme or a licensing framework in a particular area, there's probably an expectation of those you're engaging that change will happen and that you're going to be listening to their perspectives and trying to incorporate those into your management and your planning. It does raise those expectations. And we can't just solicit information from people, go and make our decisions and carry on. There needs to be that feedback loop. People are really curious. What did you do with that information that I gave you? How did it change what you were doing? And then lastly, you have to be careful because sometimes public values, public attitudes, and public preferences may not be what you expect. Sometimes we get caught up in our own echo chambers, and what seems like a rational and just decision or path forward to us might not seem that way to other people. And again, that's going to require some listening, and it's going to require an ability to perhaps slow things down a little bit as you consider what the public is thinking and how that might change your planning and management. So I know I've thrown a lot at you. Perhaps some of it was review. I don't think any of it was, sort of earth-shattering. But I hope it does help you getting to in thinking about human dimensions research differently, and hopefully ways you might use social science evidence to better to help support your decisions and the management frameworks that you're working with. Thanks very much. I think we do have a bit of time for questions, and I'm more than happy to engage.
Hi, everyone. You can go ahead and type any questions you have in the meeting chat, or you can go ahead and ask Howie directly.
You know, one thing I'll mention just as people are collecting their thoughts is I think for many of us in Canada, this notion of human dimensions is relatively new. At least in that formal sense of engaging people and trying to think about how they're interacting with their resources or how they might be affecting the places that we're managing. But there is a stronger tradition of that in the U.S. And I know that often we think about it, certainly in the Prairie Habitat joint venture context, we really are concerned about wetlands and waterfowl. But there is much to be learned from other sort of contexts as well. Forestry, for example, even in Canada, has done perhaps more than any other kind of field in engaging people, largely through this push in the 90s to certification and this recognition that if we are going to continue our forestry practices, we need to be perhaps thinking about how we do that differently and how we might engage other people to do that in a more structured way. So there's lots of local precedents and examples that we can pull from to perhaps start to inform the different ways that we might start to look at more waterfowl or wetland sorts of issues.
All right. I guess people are busily getting their thoughts together for your presentation today. I would like to encourage people to either get in touch with us or myself or John or with any questions you may have in the future, and we'll certainly pass them on to Howie. Thank you, Howie, for your presentation today. It was very interesting. And I look forward to everybody joining us for our next webinar. Thank you for everybody joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.